Yo YouTube, what's up? This is baud-lacanian on Sunday, April 24th. Almost 11 a.m. I'm just waking up and excited to do a reading of the class Matrix. It's a Vivek Chibber's book that I've been reading just to try to gain an understanding of his projects on the catalyst. I'm going to try to read all of chapter 4 today. It's about 50 pages, and I don't really have anything going on today, so I shouldn't have any interruptions. But yeah, OBS has become kind of my new affirmation board. Anything I see, I'm just kind of, putting it as part of my things in life that make me passionate and to work towards, to learn. And one of the things I'm learning this past week was machine learning and all the different toolkits that are out there and the different practices and all the different projects out there. There's literally tens of thousands of projects out there, and you just never know what's going to be like the next really awesome thing. And it's a lot of artists that are making that are using technology tools. So it's really inspiring me that artists are learning more about artificial intelligence than I am. So that's going to be part of my affirmation board, is a lot of machine learning generated artwork or other projects. But that's just going to be in the background while I read Vivek Chibber's chapter 4 today. So with that said, I'm just going to roll right into it. So chapter 4, agency, contingency, and all that. Oh yeah, I did want to do an audio check too of OBS. So I'm going to very briefly just bring it down to negative, hold on. So this is negative 27.7 decibels. This is negative 10 decibels. And this is 1.4 decibels. I think negative 1.4 decibels is too loud. So I'm going to bring it to negative 11.2 decibels and hope this is the right setting, so it's not too loud or too soft. But I'll check it later. For now, I'll read chapter 4. Agency, contingency, and all that. The preceding chapters have developed a quite austere structural theory of capitalism and its class processes. In many ways, it leans against the direction that social theory has taken in the recent past, wherein a baseline skepticism toward structural arguments has been the norm. Of course, I have also tried to generate an account of the conditions in which political agency can be effectuated given the constraints faced by subaltern groups. We thus have a theory of capitalism in which there is an interplay between structural forces on one side and the conscious, directed intervention of organized political actors on the other. To complicate matters even more, while I have developed this argument on a consistently materialist foundation, I have tried to do so while acknowledging the role of culture within both the structural and the agential dimensions of the account. In this chapter, I examine how a theory of this kind fares with regard to some of the meta-theoretical concerns of the cultural turn. As explained in the introduction, the shift toward culture was in some measure motivated by a desire to affirm the role of agency in social life. Many theorists, exemplified most famously by E.P. Thompson, felt that the structuralism of their time not only ignored social agency, but was incapable of giving it the recognition it deserved. Excuse me. The intensity and polemical ferocity with which Thompson made his case has left its mark on the debates that followed. There remains an abiding sense that structural theories cannot make sense of the way people actually navigate their lives, because these theories reduce people to little more than the bearers of social structures. Since people go about like robots, obeying the commands of the system, social processes seem governed by ineluctable laws, not conscious human action. And of course, because agency is minimized in this fashion, while the determinism of structural reproduction is amplified, the theory seems to have little hope of acknowledging, let alone explaining, the place of contingency in social interaction. I don't know what contingency means, but I guess Vivek's about to explain it. And this in turn makes structural theories incapable of acknowledging the heterogeneity and richness of social life. Heterogeneity. Yeah, I don't know how to pronounce that word. Maybe Kindle can help me pronounce it. I don't know if OBS can even show this screen, but let's see. Yeah, Kindle won't even let me pronounce it, the word. Heterogeneity is what I guess it is. And richness of social life. Structural theories flatten and homogenize the social landscape, while a focus on agency enables us to comprehend its variability. The concerns about agency are certainly valid. Some versions of structuralism have been guilty of a kind of functionalism, thereby ignoring the questions of agency, and it is also true that they gloss over the variability of social structures. But those are more instances of a theory being poorly developed than of being a poor theory. I argue that, if properly understood, a structural class theory does not have to underplay the role of conscious choice in social reproduction. Indeed, understanding the structural location of action is a crucial precondition to appreciating the content of agency. So, too, I show that, if properly calibrated, a structural class theory has the virtue of distinguishing... Oh god, I am getting a phone call. Hey, I gotta call you back. I forgot what it was. So, two, I show that if properly calibrated, a structural class theory has the virtue of distinguishing between those aspects of social life that are in fact highly constrained and thereby stable over time, and those that are beyond the influence of the class structure. In other words, the virtue of structural theory is that it enables us to appreciate the contingency or variability where it occurs, rather than treating it as a necessary feature of all social interaction. So, chapter 4.1, a reprise. The argument developed in the preceding chapters assigns some very powerful properties to the class structure. It suggests that once the structure is in place, once it has in fact displaced antediluvian economic systems, antediluvian? I think that means before the flood. I'm not sure what that means. Displaced before the flood economic systems, it imposes a very stringent choice set on the actors who inhabit it. On one side, owners are constrained to pursue a cost-minimizing, profit-maximizing growth strategy in order to survive the market. On the other, workers are compelled to offer their labor services to these establishments and do what they can to hold on to their jobs. These compulsions hold regardless of culture and geography, as do the responses to them. Far from being limited by the local meaning universe, the class structure works by subordinating the local culture to its own demands. Two implications in particular are worth drawing out. First, the argument is able to explain how it happens that capitalism generates broadly similar economic dynamics wherever it takes root. The micro-level pressures generate responses that aggregate as system-wide patterns of behavior, captured evocatively by Marx as capitalism's laws of motion, and in today's lexicon as macrodynamics. So laws of motion equals macrodynamics. I wish I had a way to... I wonder if OBS is showing me highlighting that. I will highlight it. There we go. The theory thus explains how the class structure is responsible for generating distinctively capitalist macrodynamics compared to the dynamics of state socialist systems of older pre-capitalist ones. Of course, just what those dynamics are can still be under contention. Neoclassical economics may disagree with those working in a Schumpeterian or Marxist tradition. Gosh, I don't even know. I feel like I have to look up all this stuff to understand what I'm even reading. But what most current economic frameworks agree upon is that whatever the system-wide economic patterns are, they stem from the profit-maximizing behavior of firms and workers' defense of their material well-being. In that respect, the theory recovers the foundations for a genuine political economy of capitalism, in spite of the cultural turn. Second, the theory suggests that the class structure itself underwrites capitalism's stability. This is where my argument is furthest from early Marxists and the cultural turn. Early Marxists had been aware of the stability-inducing properties of the class structure, but never adequately theorized it. They focused instead on the myriad ways class domination generated social conflict, thus reinforcing the message of the Communist Manifesto that the system tended toward its own demise. The New Left took this conclusion as the promise for its own work and turned wrongly to culture as the reason that the demise had been forestalled. My argument suggests that the main source for capitalism's stability is the class structure itself. So I'm going to highlight that because that's definitely, I guess, Vivek's thesis for chapter 4. Or for the whole book, really. Once the workforce is proletarianized, and once its members have to seek out employment in order to survive, they consent to the system, not because of the power of ideology, but because of what Marx calls the dull compulsion of economic relations. Man, this is a good chapter. This compulsion not only inserts them into the employment relation, but inclines them to opt for individualized bargaining strategies over collective ones. But the very act of opting for individual strategies ends up reproducing the domination of the employer, since, as Adam Smith noted, in a one-on-one standoff, the employer wins. It is only when all the obstacles to collective action are overcome that workers can resist as a class, and that is the exception, not the norm. Hence, the system tends toward political stability, not revolution. Chapter 4.2, Agents and Automatons. So, an argument of this kind is sure to set off alarm bells, and it should. In the recent past, theorists have become quite suspicious of theories that place a strong emphasis on structural forces. The fundamental problem is ably expressed by William Sewell. Structures tend to appear in social scientific discourse as impervious to human agency, to exist apart from, but nevertheless to determine the essential shape of, the strivings and motivated transactions that constitute the experienced surface of social life. A social science trapped in an unexamined metaphor of structure tends to reduce actors to cleverly programmed automatons. So that's another good one to highlight. A social science trapped in an unexamined metaphor of structure tends to reduce actors to cleverly programmed automatons. Man, I need to read Sewell. Several examples bearing out Sewell's concerns come to mind. The most obvious is, of course, Tackett-Parsons' structural functionalism. In a Parsonian world, structures persist because of their functionality. For the wider system, and actors are socialized into their roles, which they accept more or less automatically. On the other side of the spectrum is Louis Althusser's Marxian brand of structuralism, in which he describes his actors as Träger, quite literally as supports of social structures. Now, in Althusser's defense, his characterization of economic actors as Träger is meant to be a description of how they appear in Marx's Capital, and to some extent he is right. In the first volume of Marx's great work, the presentation of argument often resorts to a kind of Hegelian language in which the structures seem to have minds of their own. The clearest instance of this is when Marx describes capital as self-valorizing, as if capital itself has intentionality. But while this is true of his presentation, it is not true of the structure of the argument itself, which is easy to explicate in causal terms, even if Marx himself does not always succeed in doing so. In Althusser's work, however, this shortcoming is trumpeted as a virtue, and the rhetorical flaws of Marx's argument are turned into explanatory principles. Hence, whatever one thinks of the substance of E.P. Thompson's furious response in The Poverty of Theory, his consternation with Althusser's framework is easy to fathom. Structures, for the French Marxists, do seem to have mystical powers. So, there is ample precedent for the charge of that structural theories bury social agency. The question is, must they? Excuse me. Agency is a concept used to describe one way humans intervene in the world around them. It is distinguished by the fact that there is an intervention motivated by reasons, as opposed to animal instinct or pure habit. To invoke agency as the factor behind a social outcome is to suggest that the outcome was not only the product of human intervention, but intervention motivated by a set of goals. Now, it is quite possible that the outcome actually generated was not what was intended. Unintended consequences are entirely compatible with a robust conception of agency. In such cases, the analyst would be encouraged to explain how the chain of events triggered by agential intervention took a turn different from the one intended. But whether intended or not, the recognition of agency requires at its core that we connect actors' actions to the motivating reasons. This being the case, a structural theory does not have to suppress the role of social agency. The challenge is to show how structures are involved in generating reasons for the actions in question. In other words, structures can be causally relevant, not because they turn actors into automatons, but because they have an impact on the actors' reasonings about how to intervene in the world. They can perform this function because they are part of the constraints actors have to account for as they engage the world around them. Those constraints make it attractive to pursue one course of action rather than another because of the consequences they are able to impose on the individuals embedded within the structure. If we can show that actors choose to intervene in the way that they do because of the impact of the structure, hence showing that they matter because the actors acknowledge their impact on their reasoning, it is not a suppression of their agency. To the contrary, it is a fuller account of how agency unfolds in a world of constraints. Consider how this is evident in my account of the class structure. I suggest that, once it is in place, it tends toward stability, not implosion. The class structure tends to reproduce itself. This certainly sounds as if we are back to a Parsonian world of systems calling into being the conditions needed to sustain themselves. But the logic of my argument is quite different. The structure is not reproduced because it turns agents into automatons, but because it generates good reasons for them to play by its rules. The capitalist class structure generates a set of options for workers regarding their economic welfare. They can choose to either submit to the labor market or reject it. But the choices come with consequences. Workers enter the labor market and submit to an employer's authority because they deem it unwise to choose the other option. In a Parsonian world, actors pursue their course of action either because their socialization impels them to do so, or because the functional requirements of the system have the power to substitute for agential reasoning. But that is not what is happening here. In the argument I have developed, actors pursue their strategies even if their socialization enjoins them to reject it because they are actively weighing the options open to them. If it were the case that actors acceded to the structure's demands because they lacked agency, the system would actually be vulnerable to breakdown. Suppose workers accept employer authority because, as automatons, they are directed to by their programming. They follow the rules or do what they're told because they naively believe what dominant groups tell them about the world. If this were so, it would simply be a matter of explaining to them what the situation actually is, how they are being harmed by their structural situation, how it will benefit them to generate organizations for collective action, that they will flourish within an alternative system, and so on. This might take some time, of course, because a lifetime of propaganda cannot be neutralized overnight. They might be skeptical at first, even dismissive, but over time, having explained the situation to them and thereby enabling them to acquire a better sense of the harms they are undergoing, we will have restored the conditions for effective agency. They will now have the ability to consider the option of resisting the demands of the structure. And since, on assumption, the reason they submit to the structure is not because they have weighed their options, but because of their having internalized their assigned roles, there is a high probability that they will now, having learned the truth, refuse to do what has hitherto been expected of them. They will be very likely to undertake the organized resistance needed to substantially improve their situation. But in fact, as I have argued in Chapter 2, employees virtually never agree to take up collective action simply because someone explains to them the harms of employer power. The reason they hesitate is not because they are automatons, but because they have a fairly accurate understanding of their economic vulnerability. And this inclines them to proceed with caution. It will let's see. Sorry, I just lost my place. And they will tend to prioritize individualistic strategies over collective ones because even though a successive collective campaign will likely generate more benefits than an individual one, the risk-cost matrix associated with building the former is, in most situations, prohibitive. So, I just like the risk-cost matrix. It's kind of an unconscious thing that people wrangle in their minds with. In other words, they obey the rules because the class structure generates good reasons for them to do so. They submit knowingly, aware of the harms associated with their situation, but wary of the potential for even greater harm if they risk challenging their employer. This is why labor organizing is such an arduous process, precisely because employers are not blindly following the rules. This is why it takes a great deal of back-breaking work to create the culture of resistance, trust and commitment, and steely determination required to challenge employer power in capitalism. It is because workers have good reason to respect the constraints under which they subsist. Two important conclusions follow from this. First, it turns out that our choice is not just between structural theories and voluntarist ones, but also between two kinds of structural theories, functionalist versus casual. When he accuses structural theories of suppressing human agency, Sewell is unduly restricting the options to just one of the two possible varieties of structural analysis. His objections only make sense if we assume that all theories must be functionalist in form. And indeed, if that were the case, his injunction against the approach would be justified. But once we see that structural accounts can also be formulated in a causal language, the worries turn out to be misplaced. Indeed, where actors are in fact structurally constrained, such that they formulate their strategies in order to navigate those constraints, a structural theory does not efface agency so much as it helps us understand it. Secondly, this analysis enables us to also recast the relationship between determinism and agency in a somewhat startling fashion. We have seen that capitalism's remarkable stability issues from the fact that actors accept their location in the structure knowingly, not as automatons. But this is another way of saying that a process that is quite deterministic, the steady, predictable reproduction of a social relation over time, is the product of fully activated social agency. Every day, workers get up and go to their jobs, actively seek out jobs, or search for ways to move up the job ladder, while their employers seek to deploy their labor, market their products, compete against rivals, and so on. They do this because it makes sense for them given their constraints and needs. And all these activities require enormous drive, creativity, imagination, and resolve, qualities that are essential ingredients of agency. There is nothing automatic or passive about seeking out and finding a job, or holding on to one in competitive conditions, or marketing a product and winning out in the warlike domain of the product market. And this means, in turn, that a structural process, which is quite deterministic in its outcome, is generated by the active intervention of social agency. Once we allow that structures depend on conscious agency, it frees us of the worry that we must, as a rule, be suspicious of deterministic arguments in order to respect agency. That's another good one. Oh, yeah. I think OBS can see me highlighting this. But yeah, I think anything that has, the word, it frees us from the worry, like that's an important thing. It's internalized. I mean, once we allow that structures depend on conscious agency, it frees us from the worry that we must, as a rule, be suspicious of deterministic arguments in order to respect agency. I really don't even understand what that completely means, but I just like the phrase. Structural and deterministic theories are fully compatible with conscious forms of human choice, with conscious human choice. And if this is so, we can reject the glib association, virtually an orthodoxy in current debates between agency and contingency. Agency can be taken to be present in both kinds of processes, deterministic and contingent. Where they differ will be in how conscious actions are connected in the background conditions. I'm gonna just look up contingency. I don't even know what contingent really means. Subject to chance. The contingent nature of the job. Okay. So, I don't even know why something could be both subject to chance and deterministic. I don't know. I have to think about that. Let me just highlight that. I think I can make a note. Let's see. How can something be deterministic and subject to chance? So that's a note to myself to try to understand the difference. Where they differ will be in how conscious actions are connected to the background conditions. In the case of deterministic explanations, the background conditions will be a part of the explanation for the action because they, in some measure, motivated the actor to undertake the course of action we are examining. But when those conditions do not exercise a causal influence on his actions, we can deem the latter contingent with respect to those conditions. They are causally irrelevant to his interventions, hence making the latter contingent with respect to the former. Both are instances of agency, in one case occurring because agents see good reason to undertake structurally constrained courses of action, and in the other, because they are motivated by reasons not connected to the structures. Hence, instead of dismissing determinism out of hand, we are obligated to treat it as an empirical matter, to determine whether the outcomes we are examining are, in fact, deterministic or not. For surely many social processes are, And if we resolve that they are, we can then analyze how the structures produce these deterministic outcomes by generating the reasons that incline actors to choose the predicted course of action. So I have to be quite honest, I don't really understand a lot of what I'm reading in chapter 4, but I do want to just power through it, because I know I can always come back to this reading later. I can just go to the gym and just listen to my own audiobook at this point, or to listen to Vivek Chibber's audiobook with me reading it. So I will circle back to this in the future and just continue power through reading this, even though I don't really understand. I know it talks a lot about agency and contingency, but I don't even think I understand the word contingency if it's based on chance and determinism. But on to chapter 4.3, too little contingency. In this section, we explore more carefully how a structural class theory can accommodate the fact of social contingency. It is quite common to encounter the charge that this is precisely what it cannot do. The language in which this criticism is expressed varies depending on the theoretical tradition. But because of the influence of post-structuralism, the most common recent practice is to lean on the idiom associated with it. Hence, we find arguments that grand narratives, structural theories of social change or reproduction, illicitly homogenize the social landscape. As Deepesh Chakrabarty puts it, they ignore the heterogeneities and incommensurabilities of social life. Wow, those are big words. The basic idea, heterogeneities and incommensurabilities. I don't really know what those mean, but I like those words. The basic fact is that these grand narratives tend to assume structures have so much power that they leave no room for the persistence of social difference, local and regional particularities, variety across cultures, and so on, and so on. Everything flows from the structure, and nothing is allowed to deviate from its logic. Its causal force simply homogenizes the social landscape. Insofar as there is some variation, it is assumed to be temporary, so that if we wait long enough, those recalcitrant social practices, still enjoying some independence from the structure's gravitational pull, will be subsumed under it soon enough. The criticism from heterogeneity is a call to appreciate the contingencies of social life. It is a warning that any theory that describes the gamut of social institutions as being determined by one or even a cluster of structural forces is not likely to survive scrutiny. And the critics are surely justified in their admonishments against such totalizing narratives. It is self-evident that, in spite of capitalism's spread across the world, it has not dissolved national cultures. While theorists often focus on the convergence of social practices along many dimensions, it remains the case that there are recognizable differences in the way the economies and the broader culture is organized from country to country and across regions within countries. The question for us is as follows: is a structural class theory of the kind I defend capable of appreciating the persistence of social heterogeneity, or must it commit to totalizing narratives in which the juggernaut of globalizing capitalism swallows up and homogenizes entire regions and cultures? Heterogeneity from without. Looking at the history of structural class theory, there would seem to be ample reason for concern. Consider the base superstructure model central to classical Marxism. It is a quite common interpretation that economic relations belong to the base, and everything else to the superstructure. And since the base is said to determine the superstructure, it amounts to claiming that the economy determines everything that is non-economic. And if that is so, it reduces social contingency to irrelevance. The economic base is understood as precisely that juggernaut that so worries critics, rolling all over other social relations and subsuming them under its own logic. Not surprisingly, most elaborations of the theory in the post-war era have struggled to reduce the theory's ambitions, since the baseline claims are obviously unsustainable. But a structural class theory does not have to be so implausible in its claims. It does have to commit to being a totalizing theory. Recall the discussion in chapter 1. I argued that the class structure operates through culture, but it is nevertheless independent of it. What this means is that once the class structure is in place, the reproduction will not be imperiled by agents potentially failing to understand its demands. They do have to interpret what it means to be wage laborers or capitalists, but the interpretive work required of them is so minimal that it is virtually assured of success. No wage laborer fails to understand what he needs to do to seek out and maintain employment, and capitalists very quickly pick up what they need to do if they want to stay afloat. And in the event that their socialization inhibits them from accepting its demands, they will have good reason to adjust their normative stance so it accommodates their practice, as long as they are actually embedded in the structure. Wage laborers repelled by the demands of the labor market will have to adjust to it anyway, unless they find alternative means of income. But in that case, they are no longer wage laborers. So as long as they are in fact wage laborers, they will, however, grudgingly have to accommodate its demands, whatever the normative codes tell them. Of course, they will find various ways of resisting the terms of the employment relation, but that is a conflict within the structure. It presumes their participation in it, and hence their acquiescence to its basic rules, even if they strive to improve their situation within it. And so too with capitalists. It might seem that this is an argument for capitalism homogenizing the surrounding structure, as post-colonial critics charge. My claim seems to be that capitalism, as it spreads, finds an endless variety of cultures, but then subordinates them to its own logic. And this seems to be a way of resurrecting the classical Marxian claim about the economy determining the content of non-economic institutions. But I'm making a less ambitious claim, for the class structure being independent of culture but not determinative of it. This does not require of it the power to overturn some aspects of its surrounding culture, but not all of them. It only requires that the class structure transform and subordinate those components of actors' meaning orientation that block or interfere with their ability to participate in it. Consider again the example of a recently proletarianized wage laborer. He has been born with a particular worldview. He observes certain religious practices. He has his culinary preferences. He observes particular norms of components with his peers, and so on, and so on. These will reflect the wider culture into which he is born, and this culture will differ from region to region. Now, suppose that he is thrown into the labor market and forced to seek employment to sustain himself. Nothing in the theory that I have offered demands that his entire outlook and symbolic universe be rewritten in the same codes as that of a worker in Manchester or Detroit, as implied in the idea that the class structure determines culture in toto, and in doing so, tends to homogenize cultures. As it predicts, all it predicts is that he will adjust those components of culture that interfere with his ability to hold on to his job. Perhaps some part of his religious beliefs, social routines, sleeping habits, or so on. The rest of his habits, norms, and expectations can remain untouched. So too with the capitalist. The only components of his symbolic universe that will feel pressure are implicated in his ability to manage labor and turn a profit. As we scale upward and consider the implications for the region as a whole, it means that many parts of its broader culture may not feel a pressure to change and might continue as they are. Notice that this explication of the relation between structure and contingency is entirely in line with my argument in the final paragraph of the preceding section. I suggested there that if properly conceptualized, determinism and contingency are both instances of social agency. Where they differ is that in one instance, the structure generates reasons for actors to follow regular and repeated actions, aggregating into social patterns. In the other instance, the structure does not generate similar reasons for action, thereby making it difficult to predict what sort of action the agent will undertake, and hence making the action contingent with respect to that structure. So being a worker will incline the actor in that location to make certain choices in a highly predictable and regular fashion like seeking out employment and trying to hold on to it, but will not generate similarly compelling reasons in other domains, like which religious beliefs to hold on to while he seeks out employment. The class structure has a deterministic relation to the former set of actions, but a quite contingent one with respect to the latter. But both the choices are instances of agency. This suggests, in turn, that the imposition of capitalist relations could leave considerable swaths of local culture unchanged. Many aspects of local religion will continue as before. Social mores that are not implicated in economic reproduction will remain in place. Legal doctrine attending to myriad practices will continue as before, as long as it does not impede economic reproduction. And it follows that even as capitalism spreads across the world, it can support tremendous social diversity. We can sustain a sweeping grand narrative of capitalism spread and its internal tendencies, its macro dynamics and the social antagonisms it unleashes, without projecting onto it a totalizing drive. Nations can be fully capitalist but still have substantial cultural differences. There can also be enormous regional diversity within a nation if state formation occurred across a very heterogeneous social landscape. It becomes entirely possible for a nation-state to become absorbed into capitalist economic relations, but sustain numerous local cultures, rituals, political institutions, and so forth, just as these differences persist across nations. Just how much of the political and cultural matrix will have to change now becomes a more contingent matter, which will depend on the way these institutions interact with and impinge upon the demands of the class structure. Some regions might undergo a revolution in their inherited cultural practices, while others will have to make only minor adjustments. This account of the relation between the class structure and other non-economic institutions is substantially less ambitious than that of classical Marxism. The idea for a more restricted set of claims for the class structure's transformative power was pioneered by G.A. Cohen in his classic work on Marxist theory of history. Cohen contrasted two versions of historical materialism. The traditional ambitious kind, which claimed, I'm just going to highlight this. So, two versions of historical materialism. The traditional ambitious kind, which claimed extensive causal dominance of the economic base, and a more cautious one, which posited only that the base transforms those aspects of the surrounding institutions that interfere with it. This latter version he called restricted historical materialism. The view of the class structure I defend can be taken as an elaboration of that theory. It differs in only a couple of ways. First, it clarifies the micro-foundations for the theory. While Cohen stakes a claim that the economic logic of class selects against recalcitrant institutions, he is not entirely clear as to selection mechanism. He predicts that ideas that interfere with the development of the productive forces will be selected against, while those that are consistent with ongoing development will be sustained. But he does not explain how this selection occurs. This is in keeping with Cohen's view of functional explanation, namely, that it is a viable explanatory strategy even if it does not explain how a particular functional relation between the two phenomena is sustained. The explication of a mechanism helps fill out the explanation, but it is not essential for its viability. The argument I offered does provide a mechanism. It is the class actors trying to maintain their economic viability, as dictated by the structure. Of course, this is entirely consistent with Cohen's argument, since he clearly presumes that actors are not only rational in a minimal, formal sense, but also substantively in that they seek to improve their welfare. Second, and most importantly, my account is agnostic about the macroeconomic effects of the selection process. For Cohen, the components of culture being selected against are those that impede growth. This is a claim about the effects of ideas on economic productivity. In his account, the components of culture that make it through the selection process are supposed to be those friendly to the continued development of the productive forces, while the ones filtered out are those that would be hostile to economic development. Vivek's argument bases the survival of ideas not on the positive effect, but on the productive forces development. Not on their positive effect on the productive forces development, but on the economic viability of individual class actors. The difference between the two is this. Actors can defend their individual economic position without having a positive impact on aggregate social productivity. Indeed, they do it at the expense of the latter. In feudal class structures, for example, lords were able to sustain their economic position even as the productive forces stagnated for decades at a time. So the selection is not against ideas that impede societal economic welfare, but the welfare of individual class actors. And individual class actors have often, for long periods, maintained their position with no positive spillovers. Heterogeneity from within. The argument so far has placed the source of social heterogeneity in non-economic institutions. Differences between capitalist regions emanate from the persistence of ideas and practices that are beyond the reach of the economic logic of the class structure. In other words, diversity comes from phenomena that are causally independent of class. One way to express this idea is through the concept of exogeneity. These words are funny. I don't know what any of these words mean. I honestly don't know what I'm even reading anymore. This stuff is just so abstract. But I'm going to try to power through to chapter 5, which is another 10 pages. Oh god, it's a lot. Oh man, I turned off my phone just now just so I could power through this, and I got like a million more pages. But I'm going to try to do this, even though I don't know what I'm reading. God. Take a quick tea break. I mean, this stuff is just so abstract for me. I mean, this isn't my day-to-day. I mean, it's becoming my day-to-day reading it out loud, but honestly, this is just language that just people, their eyes glaze over. So I'm having to really just internalize what Vivek is saying so I can use the right language to the right people around me. But, I mean, he talks a lot about the cultural turn and just how important it is to, you know, respect people's cultures, and that's all tied to gamification too, but I'm not gonna try to unpack that now. My brain's just so poisoned by language. It's like my language center just resets every time I do these readings, but it's fine though. Scientists often describe phenomena that are beyond the influence of a causal dynamic as being exogenous to that dynamic. Conversely, phenomena that are constrained or influenced in some way by those causes are described as being endogenous to it. So, reverting to this nomenclature, one source of diversity in capitalism comes from the fact that the forces that shape many social phenomena are exogenous to the dynamics of the class structure. They are beyond its reach, and hence their story is contingent with respect to its own evolution. This is not to say that the institutions outside the influence of the class structure have no causal history of their own. These phenomena, norms, political institutions, and aesthetic preferences are shaped by a range of factors. It's just that class is not one of them. The scope of influence of economic structures is thus limited, and part of the research program of class analysis is to investigate the actual boundaries of that influence. How far does it extend into the political or ideological institutions of society? Which components does it subordinate to its logic? Those that remain outside its scope will have causal histories of its own. They are not undetermined. They are just not determined by the class structure. Or to put it differently, they are not purely contingent. They are just contingent with respect to the class structure. Hence, there will be other research agendas that seek to explain how those institutions evolved by tracing their own causal histories, much of which will turn out to be independent of economic forces. This seems to suggest that the degree of social diversity in capitalist societies depend on how many factors operate exogenously to this class structure. And this would imply that what is endogenous to the latter is relatively homogeneous, that there is a high degree of institutional and cultural convergence within the economic foundation of society. Everything linked to economic practice would tend to gravitate toward the same form, and those things that remain beyond its reach would persist in their diverse glory. We would expect then that in every region, economic institutions and those institutions that orbit around them would be quite similar in form and content. And as we extended outward to institutions that are exogenous to the economic system, we would find a wide array of social practices operating under diverse logics. But this proposal is misleading. To relegate all diversity to zones that are exogenous to the economic sphere radically underestimates the space for diversity within the economy. How is diversity possible when economic factors face the same structural pressures to increase their competitiveness, whether as sellers of labor services or as purveyors of produced commodities? The capitalist class structure imposes on its incumbents a pressure to perform. In the case of firms, for example, it demands that they adopt cost-minimizing strategies to effectively compete in the market. But how do they do it if it is not singularly determined by the market? The organization of the market and those institutions that directly impinge on it can vary enormously. So, for example, there can be a diversity in occupational structure. A capitalist economy can be predominantly agrarian or industrial. It can be dominated by services or by manufacturing. Manufacturing can be dominated by small firms, as Britain was throughout the 19th century, or heavy industry, as Germany was from the late 19th century into the mid-20th. Labor markets can vary along several dimensions. In countries of the global south, one observes the enormous weight of the informal employment, whereas in advanced industrial countries, more durable formal employment contracts still dominate. Within the advanced world, the organization of formal employment varies tremendously, with the highly unionized and regulated Nordic countries of one extreme and the United States, where more than 90% of the private sector is non-union, on the other. This is all heterogeneity within their economic structure, and it is not trivial. It points to the fact that capitalism as an economic system can be organized along very different lines, with highly variable combinations of occupational and production patterns. These variations in its organization, in turn, generate highly divergent conditions for social and economic reproduction for its incumbents. A capitalism dominated by small firms, informal labor markets, and very low levels of labor organization will pose a very different challenges for improving general welfare than a capitalism that houses large, high productivity enterprises and high levels of union density. Whereas in the former, one would expect to find a lower ceiling on wages, a wider scope for managerial discretion, and less input from labor and economic and political affairs. We would expect to find a contrast on those very dimensions in the latter. More scope for rising wages, greater constraints on employer authority, and greater influence for labor in the policy sphere. Hence, there are two sources of enduring diversity and heterogeneity in capitalism: the range of phenomena that remain exogenous to the class structure and those whose variation occurs in spite of being endogenous to it. The difference between the two is that while the former are causally independent of class, the latter are still in some way constrained by it. This means that the variation of the latter kind differs from the former in that it occurs within limits set by the class structure itself. It is a limit of functional compatibility. Phenomena that impinge directly on the economic dynamics of class are pressure to conform to its requirements. And as I argued in the preceding section, the pressure comes from the individual economic strategies of the class actors themselves. But all the actors need for the institutions to be consistent with their economic goals. As long as a range of institutions can serve that purpose, there is room for variation in their content. I explore this more in detail in section 4.5. Consider the two sources together. We can discern how misled is the boilerplate criticism, coming mostly from post-structuralist theory, but also from other quarters, that a structural class theory, a grand narrative, cannot account for diversity. Actually, the more compelling worry comes from the other side. Over the past 2 decades, some theorists have wondered if the concept has much analytical traction at all, given the enormous diversity of institutional configurations compatible with capitalism. The classical Marxists, for example, once held the view that there was a deep tension between capitalism's profit-maximizing imperative and the egalitarian goals of the labor movement. But the experience of the post-war decades seems to show that egalitarian institutions, such as those of the social democratic states in Western Europe, were quite compatible with capitalism. If this is so, we have a system that not only allows for institutional variation, but it is so permissive as to be constraining in name only. As Fred Bloch queried, is there any point in retaining the concept at all? This sounds very, I don't know, sounds a little apologetic for the Western Europe institutions that, I don't know. I'm gonna have to just highlight all this and just be highlight it. I'm gonna say, this sounds too defensive, apologetic to European, social democratic institution. I don't know. Can you really say that European social democratic institutions are successful right now with what's going on in Greece? There's a lot of far-right groups. I mean, it's not a right or left thing anymore, but I mean, it is about violence and exploitation, and there's a lot of exploiting groups in Western Europe right now. So, I don't know. I'm just gonna think about that another time. Chapter 4.4, too much contingency. Not all instances of diversity are a challenge for a structural class theory. I've tried to show that, if properly understood, the theory has a quite clearly delimited zone of causal determination. It not only is able to accommodate the fact that many phenomena are beyond its influence, but insists on it. The kind of diversity that pose a potential problem are those that appear to run directly against the imperatives that, according to the theory, drive the system. Egalitarian institutions are potentially anomalous for this reason. By egalitarian, I mean two things: arrangements that reduce the inequality of income and wealth, and those that reduce the inequality of power. Hence, they are equalizing in a very broad sense. A system premised on deep inequalities on both these axes, and which is supposed to impose strict limits on the degree to which the institutions within it can diverge from its core imperatives, should screen out any significant impulse in this direction, even if it is happy to accommodate shifts in directions that are neutral on the score. For this reason, the emergence of social democratic institutions in post-war Europe poses something of a challenge to structural class theory. First of all, the institutions constructed under its aegis, did substantially, I don't know what aegis means, let me just look that up. In the protection, backing, or support of a particular person or organization, negotiations were conducted under, okay, so it's the protection. So, first of all, the institutions constructed under its protection did substantially mitigate the materialist inequalities generated by an unregulated capitalism. The Nordic countries, for example, seem to be on an entirely different plane than the United States, which has the most anemic redistributive thrust of any advanced industrial country. On a large variety of dimensions, the Nordic social democracies rolled back not only the economic inequalities of an unregulated capitalism, but also made enormous advances in reducing the labor market insecurities associated with it. And just as importantly, they dramatically reduced the unilateral power of employers in the workplace. Employers were forced to negotiate with labor unions over a range of decisions over which they once had complete authority: wages, pensions, work hours, hiring, firing, and even investment decisions. These changes were not just a permutation capitalists stumbled upon as they sought to maximize profits. They were not innovations promoted by capitalists to further their economic interests. They were, in fact, dramatic ruptures in the economic logic of the system. Their emergence required steering capitalist markets in a direction they would have never taken otherwise. Second, social democratic capitalisms also turned out to be highly profitable for capitalists. On most every measure of growth in capitalism, social democratic systems did as well or better than the more free market system of the United States. If we look at productivity, per capita income, aggregate profitability, labor market participation rates, and international competitiveness, in all these domains and more, the economies of Northern and Western Europe were incredibly successful. And in spite of their slowdown in the very recent past, their performance is still comparable to that of the United States. The economic success of this form of capitalism is at least partly responsible for survival over time. Had social democracy been an economic disaster, it would not have survived for long. But its basic institutions continue to enjoy massive support in the general population, despite the constriction of its redistributive mechanisms. If social democracy had been a short-lived phenomenon, perhaps like the highly controlled wartime system in the United States that was quickly dismantled once the war ended, or the Soviet-style command economies that lasted barely more than half a century, it would not pose a theoretical problem for a structural class theory. Indeed, its short lifespan would be a vindication of the argument that capitalism selects for institutional varieties that are consistent with its base logic. But the fact that its duration is approaching 100 years in some parts of Europe, that it continues to be quite profitable for its employers, and that its extinction does not seem imminent, even though its weakening is undeniable, poses a challenge. What does it mean to say that the class structure puts limits on institutional variation when the variation is so extensive as to include forms that seem to contradict some of the system's deepest tendencies? One response would be to simply deny the premise that the range of variation is very significant. This strategy would rely on the fact that whatever institutional variety we might see, however egalitarian social democracy might be, is still short of socialism. The basic idea would be that in preventing social democracy from achieving the levels of economic redistribution we might reasonably desire, the constraints imposed by this class structures are in fact significant. This being the case, there is no real challenge to the theory, since the theory only predicts that the class structure screens out institutions that undermine its basic logic. Since we know that social democracy was highly profitable, and hence did not threaten capitalist interests, and also see that its egalitarian thrust had real limits, we could safely assert that the theory stands confirmed in its fundamentals. Social democracy had the support of the employer class, as any capitalism must, and it put limits on what labor could demand, as every capitalism does. There is some merit to this response. It is true that social democracy screened out economic and political outcomes that would be highly desirable, would be more consistent with widely held conceptions of justice, and would most likely have substantial support within the population. But while true, this argument cannot be enough to dismiss the theoretical challenge. It seems somewhat dogmatic to insist that as long as a redistributive regime is still capitalism, the argument for the system's constraints stands vindicated. The whole point of the challenge is to explain how such remarkable levels of redistribution could be achieved at all in a system where the micrologic of the firm drives owners to engage in wage suppression. A critic might respond to the dismissal by insisting that if this is capitalism, why object to it? It is falling short of socialism, to be sure, but why use that as the contrast case? Why not compare it with the barbarity of free market Victorian economies or all the depredations of an unregulated 21st century capitalism? If social democracy looks like thin gruel compared to a full-blown socialism, it looks like a wondrous advance compared to the free market alternatives. Further, a critic might go on to observe that the socialist counterfactual is, in any case, purely imaginary. While we are free to compare redistributive capitalisms with it, we do not in fact know that the more ambitious ideal of socialism is even achievable. We have not yet seen any examples of it. The Soviet-style economies did achieve a significant reduction of inequalities, but also failed to lift the aggregate standards of living over time. What they did gained in egalitarianism, they lost in economic dynamism. And this gave the system a tendency to level living standards downward rather than lifting them up. So the critic would continue, far from capitalism falling short of a more desirable end that we witnessed in a social democracy at its peak might in fact be approaching the best we can do. To focus on what it screens out is interesting, but of no practical significance. Hence, the mutability of capitalism does pose a challenge to structural class theory. We need to explain what it gained by insisting on the limits imposed by the class structure when the system is clearly so malleable. So I'm coming up to chapter 4.5. Let's see, I don't even know how long I've been streaming for. I guess 58 minutes now. I'm trying to power through all of chapter 4, and quite honestly, I am losing comprehension of what I'm reading. Let me see how much more I have to read. Yeah, this is a lot to read to get to chapter 5. So rather than reading 20 more pages, I'm going to go ahead and close out this stream. So this is me just kind of practicing my vocabulary and me practicing my reading comprehension and me, circling back to this in the future so I can, test my OBS audio settings and also just, embrace Vivek Chibber's ideology, you could say, of sorts, yeah, his anti-ideology, and to understand the nuances of how Vivek's ideas can be contrasted with Zizek. So that's really the point of me reading this book, even though I don't understand 90% of it. I think I maybe understood maybe half of it when I first started reading, but it just gets so abstract, and bless the editor that read this book because it's just very complicated for me to understand. And frankly, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking about work while reading, which is crazy. So I'm this is one of the reasons why I can't comprehend what I'm reading, is I'm stressed out from work, and with my time energy, as Theory Plebe would say, I can probably increase my comprehension, but in the meantime, I'm going to do this day-to-day stream as practice, so I can practice my comprehension and gain a base literacy in Vivek Chibber's ideas. So anyways, thanks YouTube for listening. It's been an hour and it's been real, and now I am going to be quilted by the real.